Catherine Connolly.
Garmila Magad Laskin Corla, and I Faltium Revangesh, Portugal Lacus, a G-Sportach Shaw, August Tommy, Kate Fincative here, then Villa, August Mahakiok Don Villa, August Cogorgicus Don Realtus, go will she the Nuran Adala, con on Veer Shaw, a Wanch, a Ma. I welcome the opportunity to take part in this debate, and I'm fully supportive of this bill, and well done to the government in relation to it. And I was thinking about this and thought maybe I should just stand up and briefly say I agree with it and well done, which I have done. But then I thought about this and I thought we had to have a referendum, and it's just over a year since we had it, the 26th of October 18. And really we should have had it back in 09, and as the previous speaker said, that government failed to grasp the mettle at that stage. And that set me thinking as to why they did, because right from 99 onwards, and I want to pay tribute to the Oireachtas Library and for their paper, the Oireachtas Library and Research Service, and they've done an excellent paper in relation to this. Just let me place that on the record. And they say from 91 onwards, the Law Reform Commission recommended that it should be deleted, and they advised that religious adherence could be protected, and it's extremely important that they would be protected by the incitement to hatred legislation. That was back in 91, that was the Law Reform Commission. 95, the Constitutional Review Group recommended something similar. 2006, the report of the Special Rapporteur on Freedom of Religion or Belief. I won't go into it, same thing. 2007 report of the Joint Oireachtas Committee on the Constitution. Now, this was 2 years before Minister Hearn felt that he had to, there was a lacunae. And the committee endorsed in 2007 the view of the Constitution Review Group, recommending that Article 46(1) should be deleted. That was 7. 9, the legislation was brought in, which I'll go back to. But subsequent to 9, we had 3 other. We had the Venice Commission, the UN Human Rights Committee, and the Convention on the Constitution. And then we also had a paper by Peter Charlton, who we've revered in this chamber, and rightly so, in relation to the Charlton report. And he concluded in 2017 that from a constitutional perspective, laws on blasphemy are not a necessity, despite being specifically mentioned in the Constitution. And he compared it to the constitutional references to felony crimes, which, although mentioned in the Constitution, no longer existed in Ireland. So we had a long lead in to 2009 when we decided as a country that we weren't mature enough to take this out. And I thought about that. And I looked and I said, what happened in 2009? And what happened in 1999, 10 years before that, when the case that set all this in train, the independent newspaper case in 1999, and when the Supreme Court said there's no definition and we can't deal with this because there's no definition, it took another 10 years for the government to look at that, and when they did, they failed to actually act, and they brought in legislation that was just not, was never going to work. So if we look at 1999, that was the year the Taoiseach apologised for the abuse. And if we look at the year 2009, when this Dáil was concerned with bringing in legislation so that we wouldn't insult the Christian God, in 2009 was the year that the Ryan report came out. And the Ryan report came out with its very specific conclusions and recommendations. I can't read them all out, but I think it's important for the record to say there were 21 recommendations and 43 conclusions. And the conclusions, amongst them, a number stand out, they all stand out. Sexual abuse was endemic amongst the boys' institutions. Sexual abuse endemic. The recidivist nature of the abusers was known to the religious authorities, but they didn't do anything about it. And a surprising sentence, I think the Ryan report was startled by the level of emotional and physical abuse and so on. And they made 21 recommendations and 43 conclusions. And the lessons that should be learned from the past, The congregations need to examine how their ideals became debased by systemic abuse. They must ask themselves how they came to tolerate breaches of their own rules, and, when sexual and physical abuse was discovered, how they responded to it and to those who perpetrated it. They must examine their attitude to neglect and emotional abuse, and more generally, how the interests of the institutions and the congregations came to be placed ahead of those children who were in their care. Acceptance and understanding by the state and the congregations is the acknowledgement of the fact that the system failed the children, not just that children were abused because occasional individual lapses occurred. So the system failed the children. So you'd ask me, what has this to do with the debate on blasphemy? And I'd ask you to reflect on what the governments were caught up with when this report was coming out and when the apology was given. So in 1999, the apology paralleled with the Supreme Court case in relation to blasphemy. 10 years later, 2009, we bring in legislation which simply isn't going to work at the very same time that the Ryan report tells us about the abuse. And in terms of cost, and the Controller and Auditor General has given us the costs, they're startling, really. The estimated cost of the redress scheme was 250 million. The actual cost, and still rising, 1.25 billion. If we take the two together, the child abuse inquiry and the redress, it was 1.4 billion back in 2015. The reason for the underestimation, of course, was the negotiation and the consultation with the religious orders, which clearly underestimated the nature and the extent of the abuse, which the government was happy to accept. Just again, to give the extent of the abuse. Finally, under the Redress Board, which dealt with 139 scheduled institutions, 15,562 offers were accepted. And almost half of those came from 10 institutions. Now, it makes for difficult reading, and it's important to place it on the record, because when there's a debate, and 10 years ago, not 10 years, 10 years ago in 2009, and the debate is limited to whether we insult God, and a particular God at that, and we ignore all of this being done in God's name, then really it's time to reflect. Have we moved from that, Minister? And I would say that we have not moved very much if we look at our experience under Carranua. Again, a misnamed organisation, New Friend, which was anything but a new friend. And so I happily support this piece of legislation. I wish we didn't have to support it. I wish that it wasn't brought in 2009, and I wish that we had the courage as a country to have had the referendum then. We finally got the courage to do it last year, but I would have to say on the back of a tremendous amount of suffering. Just last week, I attended Land Without God, Mannix Flynn's film, and I would ask you all to attend it. And his opening sentence is, "I was the child in the children's court, found guilty and condemned at 6 years and taken away in handcuffs." This is a film that has taken over 10 years to make, and more significantly, it has taken lifetimes for his extended family to begin to speak about their experience in the institutions. I want to pay tribute to Mannix Flynn, to Maeve McMahon and to Lotta Petronella for this film, and the words used by Fintan O'Toole to describe it. I mightn't agree with all four of them, but I certainly agree with that it's haunting and that it's devastating. He also describes it as poetic and moving. The first time that some members of the family were ready to speak. And yet this country was caught up with defamation and taking God's name in vain, as opposed to looking at what was being done in the name of God. Thank you. Gar míle mágad.